Happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome to Insights Now's last webinar of 2021. Today, we have what you might consider an unusual topic to end the year on. It's around this idea of failure. And failure is a pretty broad term. We're specifically focusing on the idea of failing faster and what that means for innovation. So I'll get us up here as a group, and then the rest of our conversation is going to be panel style. So for each section, I will share the core question on the screen to ensure that everybody is able to follow along. And I'm going to be transparent. In order for me to share my screen the most efficiently, and I've got 3 different monitors working for the session today, and for you to be able to see our guests and the content, I'd like to start off by giving just a few tips to improve your own viewing. So in your webinar window right now, you should see the 3 of us probably at the top of the screen and then the slides right below that. If you take your mouse, you should be able to select that little line or that bar that separates the 2, and you can expand our videos by dragging that top section down just a little bit until you find a comfortable viewing ratio between ourselves and the deck that makes it a little bit easier for you to see all of the content. So while you're taking a moment to adjust your screens, I do notice when I'm looking through our attendee list here that we have some new names, or at least new to me names, that have joined us today. Welcome. We are very happy to have you. I'm Kate Hamilton, and I'm the director of Insights Now's Innovation Center, which is an online collaborative research platform. And with me for today's discussion is Mimi. She is the leader for the Global Consumer Intelligence Nourish Group over at IFF. And we also have Cheryl, who is the president of Stellar Strategic Services. And both of these women have really deep expertise in product development. Now, you might be wondering, why these guests? How did the 3 of us come together for this particular topic? And a few months ago, our 3 teams worked on a study that really redefined the value of failing fast for the purposes of innovation. Mimi will be sharing her voice from what we might call the, quote, client side, and Cheryl is one of our qualitative research consultants that we work with often. And like I mentioned, all of our 3 companies work together pretty regularly in this new product development or innovation space. Now, while I do have a few primed questions for our panel today that I mentioned I'm going to be sharing right here on this screen, you are also welcome to join the discussion as well. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the attendee panel where you'll see a spot for sending in questions. You can use that same section if you're having any technical issues. So maybe you were having a hard time adjusting those video sizes, or if you need help with your audio connection, my colleague Shelly is on the line and she has access to those inputs as well. So if you put something in there, she will jump in and try to assist you to keep you engaged with our content. Now, a question that always comes up, so I'm going to try and beat you to it, is yes, next week we will be sharing a recording of the presentation with everyone who registered, and that recording will also have subtitles added in. So you'll have the chance to revisit this conversation and the topic on your own time, or even share it with team members who couldn't be here today. When the 3 of us were planning today's session, we realized, we want to know a little bit about you all as well. So for a quick poll that I'm about to launch, we want to know, how often is failure encouraged with your team? So on your screen, you should see our video and our slides might have gone away for a moment while you're answering that poll. And while you're answering that, I don't know if it might be an elephant in the room for some of us, but I just can't help but not point out the picture that we have representing our topic for today. Out of all of the stock photography options out there, I was honestly a little surprised how difficult it was to find a picture representing the positive aspects of failure. What does that metaphor look like? Because failure is such a negative word usually. The closest we could come up with was this balloon popping amusement park game. And, that's just one version. These types of games are common at theme parks and amusement parks, where in summary, the more things you break, the larger the reward. And that's putting it really simply. Most of the time, there's probably a speed component to these games too, right? So like the faster you pop them or the more pops per minute, you might win a larger prize. And honestly, that's not really too far off from what failing faster means. The quicker you can break things, or the quicker you can find gaps in your development, the quicker you can course correct and have a bigger or potentially better payoff. So we've got a majority of the people here who have voted. So let's close this poll and then share the results. So you should see on your screen now where occasionally failure is encouraged. And we know that we left that question really broad, and that was a little bit intentional because the next question that we'd actually love for you to engage with us with is, how does your team define failure? I'm going to do my best to monitor these comments as they come in, so you can use that little question window I pointed out earlier. And I'm gonna read them as our session is going on and try to bring up some of these comments along the conversation. Oh, sorry, was I not sharing my slides again? Okay, there you go. There's the question on the screen again. So how do you define failure with your team? All right, so without further ado, I'm going to start sharing the mic with our guests today. Together, we collectively came up with these 6 main themes that we'll be talking about through our next 40 minutes or so together. And the first one, in my opinion, will really help settle some of the questions that you may be asking yourself. Since we shared this month's webinar topic, there's been a lot of discussion internally and with other brand teams about this idea of failing as a specific research design. Oh, tell me more about that. What's that style look like, or what are the techniques that you're using? So during the introduction slides a few moments ago, I did reference a project that our 3 teams worked on together. This was back in October. And while the research design supported our objectives, and honestly, I hope all of your research studies are supporting your objectives, we tapped into both qual and quant execution styles, and there were a lot of different exercises and techniques that came together. But we're not quite sure if it can be framed as a, quote, methodology. Would it work for someone else? Can we take that same layout and apply it to another product category or industry? And during that discussion with Mimi and Cheryl, we decided we wanted to take a couple steps back. So Mimi, why don't you kick us off with this first question from your perspective? Is failing fast a methodology?
So I would say failing fast isn't necessarily a methodology. It's more of a mindset, right? It's connected to that agile mindset. It is usually talked about and connected and associated with any sort of user-centered design thinking. But it's more of a mentality or a mindset. I think one of the ways that has helped me think about it is just really having teams embrace kind of this mindset of experimentation. And that's what failing fast is. It's just the idea that, yeah, we're working on an innovation project. We probably have some initial insights, and from those we start developing some new concepts. And if it's truly an innovation project, those concepts are new, or truly new and truly different. And the idea with failing fast is, let's get some feedback on those concepts very quickly. And if we're really far off, or if there's some huge obstacles that we didn't think about before, we're going to find that out very quickly, and we're not going to waste a lot of time and energy going down a path that we've realized maybe isn't the best path, and we can choose some alternatives. So I think it's a culture, it's a mentality, it's a mindset, however you want to think about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, it definitely takes corporate buy-in. If your company and your stakeholders are not kind of believing in that idea of failure as learning, then you're not going to be able to kind of go down that path and get the benefit of what failure can bring you. And really, when you think about failing fast as a methodology, There's many methodologies that will get you to failing fast, right? You can use qual or quant, but the idea is that it needs to be creative designs to get to these things, and really kind of get where you want to go and going right back to your objectives and your KPIs.
Yeah, and both of you are talking about something that is going to lead us into our next topic here, as well as something that came up in that little exercise we just did a second ago, is that some people might feel that failure in innovation isn't really defined. So if we go to the next question, like, what's the difference between failing big or failing fast in this context of new product development, right? If it's not a methodology and it's a mindset and it's a concept, a mental construct that we need to adapt to culturally as a team, then let's dice out fast versus big in the failure context.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kick that one off. I think of failing fast, failing big is kind of, you're failing with big expenditures of money, capital, manpower, potentially missing the mark entirely, launching a product and then pulling it back off the shelves. I mean, that's failing big. And that's kind of, this idea of putting something into full distribution and then having to pull it back. I mean, that's kind of as big as it gets for the most part, right? But failing fast is this idea of kind of what Mimi was talking about earlier, where you get quick answers along the way. You're making the next best business decision based on what you learn. It's more kind of, whether you're pulling in questions that are internal, the stakeholder buy-in, their ideas or pet products, or external consumer motivations, benefits, concepts, product features, packaging, all those elements that kind of go into what can you learn really quickly and make the next best decision as you move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you even said it before, Cheryl, it's about learning, just learning in general, and having that mindset of learning and learning as much as you can, as early in the process as you can, versus waiting till the end after you've invested all sorts of time, resources, energy, creativity, people's soul, in the creative process, and then realizing, wow, that I wish we would have learned earlier that that this was not a good path to go down. So
yeah, I think that also, it goes to helping you understand what you didn't even think to address or ask in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
The broader you go with that, the more you can learn up front, the more you're like, oh, I really didn't know that was even an area to worry about, or an area of concern or a pain point for people, or an area of an interest for that matter.
Yeah.
So one of you mentioned this a moment ago, and it's related to a different comment that came in about examples of failure in terms of a definition. So if a product fails to launch, how does that fit into failing big versus failing fast? So is it that actual original idea doesn't come to life and that's seen as a failure, or throughout all of the iterations that you might have done through your concepting research and bringing it to life, it still didn't come to fruit? Is that something that either of you can talk on?
Yeah, Mimi, do you want to take it, or?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
I think the whole idea of failing fast is about that iteration process, right? Because every time you learn something about your concept that doesn't work, or that's an obstacle, or that's something important that the concept doesn't address, now you can make the next iteration. And so I think it's really all about failing fast on a certain iteration so that you can make the next iteration. That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that, just in terms of defining failure, I think that also goes back to your objectives and your key performance indicators, right? If you set those up ahead of time, if all your stakeholders are involved, the communication is going, expectations are being managed, it's just like saying, what's a win, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't know what's a win for you in the end, you don't know how to make a decision. And if you don't know what you consider a failure, you're not going to know whether it's a failure. So laying it out ahead of time and thinking through the various different aspects of what a win and a failure might be is going to help you make decisions along the way.
And I think you have to remind your teams about that quite a bit, right? Remember, guys, this is the reason we wanted to do this. This is our goal, and kind of help people reflect back on the goal. And so they can really utilize either the failing fast or deciding to move forward.
Yeah, and aligning the teams on what those things are, because everybody has a different investment in a different area, right? You might have product developers or packaging developers, or I mean, number of different people have a different hand in the innovation process. So one person's idea of failure might be different from somebody else's. So if we can get everybody on the same page, then it manages their expectations as you move forward.
Now, both of you are talking about the elements of team and relying on your team a little bit, like in this context. So I know one of the challenges that we face, and I'm sure other teams have faced, is managing expectations for if something's being failed fast or if it's being failed in the bigger context. So from the supplier side, we'll often get a whole gambit of different objectives or different types of research studies that a client wants to do. And part of our job as consultants, which Cheryl, I know you are deeply familiar with, and Mimi, you as well, with leading multiple teams and coordinating within IFS, is where do we actually start? Like, yes, I realize you want to get there, but is developing a product off of an idea with no kind of concepting really the smartest way to spend $500,000? Or that would, to me, would be a potential example of failing big. There was a huge investment in something, but it was in the wrong order of operations. Mimi, can you speak to like how do you re-guide teams to think about, okay, is it failing fast or failing big when there's budget involved?
Yeah, I think one of the things about doing an iterative process and getting feedback early on concepts and knowing what works and what doesn't and what fails and why it fails, that all speaks to helping to understand, you know, probably for any given concept, if you spend enough time and money, you can make it work and you can find the right consumer group. But I think it's facilitating that discussion about, you know, what are the trade-offs here? How much time and effort would it need for us to iterate on this concept to overcome the obstacles we learned about? And is that worth it in the end, right? And what's the potential? And I think you know, it can be kind of a hard discussion when you're working with innovation teams that are really passionate about some of these ideas that were tested. But I do think when you have the insights, when you have data, when you have facts and perceptions from consumers, obviously that really helps anchor the whole conversation. Because without it, it's really people just kind of talking through more their passions and their emotions and their own ideas about something versus understanding, right, what the bigger picture is and what we're learning. So sometimes that's hard for people to kind of take some time to acknowledge, but I think it's a part of our job as the insights professionals to guide that conversation and remind people again, what are we trying to do here at the end of the day? What are the trade-offs? Of course, any creative team can make something that is interesting for a few people, right? Is that really what we want to do here? Or are we looking to do something to a little bit of a larger group, and is that worth it? So that's a facilitated conversation for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's also, just keeping in mind that it's about the voice of the consumer as well, right? I mean, otherwise, why do research at all if we could make all decisions at the manufacturer level and move forward and everything's successful? I mean, the idea is to understand what our consumers and potential consumers want and need, right? So, I mean, that's all about insights for me.
There's a question that just came in before we change to the next topic. Are either of you able to provide an example of a project where failing fast kept a new product on track?
I'm sorry, say that again. Where failing fast kept a new product on track? Is that what you said?
Example of a project where failing fast kept a project on course or on track for development. And that might require a project that identified pivots early on, or maybe a project then identified a flaw early on that was pivotal in the final development. Do either one of you have an example that's shareable?
I
Shareable.
don't, yeah, I don't think I can speak to something super specific because it's typically for very specific customers. But I mean, to me, I think that happens all the time, right? You know, sometimes you failing fast means, wow, you found out like the essence of this concept just doesn't work. But other times you find out that just parts of a concept doesn't work, and so you can quickly tweak that ultimately that product you can tweak well enough so that it gets launched. And that's, I've experienced that several times. I would say it's less frequent where I've experienced failing fast early in a process, realizing, wow, this whole essence of this concept doesn't work, and so it never goes anywhere. I'd say more frequently, we're absolutely using learnings from you know, failures to iterate better, and those products ultimately do launch.
I'll try to give a more specific example without getting too specific and giving things away. But I once worked on an innovation project that involved a spicy food. And of course, it starts with concept, right? And understanding at the very beginning what are people's interpretations of spicy, and how spicy can come in a number of different characteristics and flavor profiles, as well as concepts. And where people's backgrounds are and how they start and look at spicy, it's all relative. I mean, so it was really early on that we learned that spicy did not mean the same thing for every spice. Spicy had different degrees associated with it, and it depended on a whole host of things, not the least of which was your background, your experience, the products you normally choose, your family origin. I mean, there's a lot of things involved in it. And so there were many pivots right from the get-go, and how things were interpreted, and even how the product continued to be developed in future iterations. I don't know, does that help?
Yeah, thank you both for that. I know it wasn't initially one of our questions, so just trying to keep up with what our audience is writing in. So going into our next question here, which is all about finding and working with an actual innovation testing partner. And transparently, obviously I'm on the supplier side, Cheryl is also on the supplier side. I think we always try to keep in mind with objectives is how do we as suppliers be objective to a client's product development, right? I mean, that old adage, don't kill anyone's baby. Somebody's going to be passionate about this. Somebody's going to want this to succeed. All bets off, no matter what the actual data says. So using the word objective in a different context, we need to be objective about the results and what the voice of the consumer might be. So Cheryl, what advice do you have for people who are hiring suppliers to look for? Like what are the types of things you would talk about as the supplier side for why you would be a great innovation partner, or the types of criteria to look for?
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to consider is partnering with a team who is really passionate about innovation, right? Those people who are excited about digging, finding pain points, turning pain points into opportunities, and figuring out where all the buzz is, as well as all the innermost desires and needs are. That passion can go a long way. But also just really finding somebody who's a truly collaborative partner, I think is really, really important. In failing fast, the collaboration between the teams, not just your main client contact, but the broader team of all the stakeholders involved, that's really important to keep that communication. A lot of conversations, early conversations, people who are ready to really roll up their sleeves and get in there with you with the nitty-gritty. And I would say really important also are looking for partners who are well-versed in multiple methodologies, including things like qual and quant and a whole bunch of research tools in the toolbox, because it's that creativity that happens when you're trying to be in this new innovation space. You're not necessarily doing something you did before. Everything is new, and you're pulling in, your experience and a lot that you've done, but you're pulling it in new ways for different categories, for different product ideas, things that have never been done versus things that are a little bit just a line extension or whatever. But I think that idea of having lots of tools in the toolbox is also really important.
Jeannie, what would you add to that from the other
Yeah.
side of the equation?
Yeah, so I can tell you that one of the most important things for me, and Cheryl mentioned it, but it's just listening. You know, partners that truly are listening to your very unique scenario. You know, in the innovation space, which if it's innovation, it's probably pretty unique, pretty interesting, and having a lot of those upfront conversations, and feeling like you're really being listened to. And I agree that yes, lots of tools, but not only lots of tools and lots of very you know, obviously good tools and diverse set of tools, but the willingness to be flexible with those tools as well, like to be innovative with the way you think about those tools. I know in our project we used a lot of different tools. And we also used a couple in I think a very different way than they had been used before. You know, we said we did qual, we did quant, we did implicit, explicit, we did some highlighting, we did also we used pricing questions to not necessarily set a price, because that's not what we were after, but to understand value. So I think it's kind of those, you know, listening, great tools, and the flexibility to adapt those tools for your client's unique situation.
Yeah, I think that leads us really nicely to the next question that we have on here about determining a research design, and particularly a research design for something that's new to this world. So the project that the three of us worked on, there's a couple of different types of new product development, right? Like maybe a product already exists and your company's building on an extension of something or expanding the idea of something that consumers are already aware of. And then you can take the example that we talked about as a group a couple of weeks ago, driverless cars. So when driverless cars were first being ideated 10, 15, 30 years ago, whatever it was probably really difficult to grapple with from a consumer perspective. What do you mean a car without a driver? Like, that's never going to happen. And then here we are in 2021, and those are being piloted. Like, it's actually coming to life. So when you're in a situation where your innovation is truly new to this world, how do you determine with your innovation partner that type of research design and the pieces to put together to coordinate whatever your discovery story is going to be?
You want me to go?
I think, you know, new concepts and true innovation, as you were talking about, Kate, it doesn't have normative database against which you can compare a top 2 box purchase and trust, you know, so you have to define success differently. So again, it comes back to objectives and KPIs. And I think your research design definitely needs to build in controls against which you can kind of compare additional new innovations, new products, new packaging, whatever it is, but build in the controls like that into the design, which, by the way, also includes understanding where the consumer is coming from. How would they place this? Where would they place it? Are you even on the mark in the category you're putting it in? What would they be comparing it potentially to? And so building in some of those controls, and maybe you don't know exactly what it is, but building in a few different ones to be like, you know what, they put this in the category over here, and we're doing this research and it includes those controls. Now we can look at something in the relative instead of in the absolute. And again, it comes back also to the stakeholders and how they're seeing things and what we're comparing to there. One of the things I want to mention too is with the methodologies, whatever you're using, qual, quant, maybe you're using both, but maximize the methodological strengths of, say, qual and quant when you're doing this kinds of things and you're trying to design effective strategic research, because I think you can very simple example, if you have a quant survey, there's no need to put in a bunch of open-ended questions if you're going to have a qual portion of it where you could deep dive those things, right? So use the strengths of each methodology to pull out the pieces you need to learn the whole picture.
Yeah, and I have some specific things I've been honing in on, just thinking about this a bit when we're designing research for like these totally new to the world concepts. And I think it's just, maybe it's fundamental, but it's just the idea that as we're designing the research, we want to make sure we design it so that we're allowing ourselves to uncover the user's mental models, right? Because when you have a totally new to the world, like you said, driverless cars, that is a very different mental model of what consumers think of that experience of driving a car. And the whole idea with this early feedback on these initial concepts is to really get at some of the core of the user's current mental models and how those connect or don't connect, and what might lead to overcoming some of those disconnects along the way. And I think one of the things to keep in mind when you do that is that you want to really think about, when you're doing this early on, the lower fidelity the concept, the better, right? Because which for us was a little tricky in our research, but the more simple the concept, the more fundamental the learning you get about the how this compares, the conceptual model versus the mental model of the potential user. And so I think having low fidelity paper concepts, and for us it was also putting together and testing a couple different concepts at the same time,
Right.
that had some variations that were all very new and different, but also had some variations, so we could learn within those variations as well. And I guess the last thing about the research design is sometimes when you have these new concepts, you don't even know who the target consumer is, right? And I think in our research, that was another important piece where we spent a lot of time talking about that, like who should we ask about this? We think we have a general idea of who the target consumer would be, but we had to think really differently, I think, about that and get kind of creative in the way, we didn't just use some of the typical types of demographics or psychographics you would use. We really looked at some interesting behaviors. We were seeing some real weak signals. We segmented consumers based on that. Turned out that wasn't even important at the end of the day, but we didn't know that. But I think when you're designing this research early on, you need to think a little bit differently about everything.
I think that goes to like casting that net broad too, right? With who you're talking to. If you narrow that focus and you're like, well, these people aren't interested in it. Well, maybe you narrowed it too far. Maybe it would have been interesting to some other group. So keeping that open. And I think one other point that I would bring up is keep room for adaptation based on the learning, right? You may find out that this particular consumer group was not interested and you thought they would be, but maybe there's a couple extra days built into that online bulletin board where you can go in and ask additional questions of, that will kind of spark off of learning you've already had in the first 3 days, for example, but leaving room for additional learning based on what you've already learned in the previous few days.
So based on one of the comments that came in, I want to take like a little bit of a side chat really quick on Mimi, something that you mentioned, but was a very core part of our project was about concepting and paper concepts. So in 2021, I feel like a lot of innovation teams go from like 0 to 60 very quickly. We have a lot of like 3D printers available. We have a lot of tools and resources that can legitimately bring something from like a mental construct into a physical construct very quickly. But sometimes that's too fast. So in this conversation that it fails fast, you can fail too fast, probably a little bit too, and then you're starting to get into that fail big situation. So with these 2D paper concepts, which is essentially what we came up with, I think that there's a confidence level that some teams need to have that it's okay to make things up. It's okay if none of this is true yet. It's okay if we don't really know all of the parameters. So again, in our project example, this was something that was going to be new to this world. While there were no boundaries to consider, like sometimes that was a little bit like frustrating, like how do we put our own construct or our own boundaries in place? So Mimi, can you talk about how important concepting is to your teams that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, Katie, so in our particular project, we had a very new experience around just the whole general idea of supplementing, right? And around health and wellness. And we wanted to understand this concept. We wanted to understand, we had some initial hunches and ideas about some of the questions that were important, but there wasn't anything to compare it to. So we decided just to make up, other potential concepts, right? That they were all new, and we kept a couple things standard and just deviated a few, like good experimental design. We just deviated a few of the parts. And that was really necessary to kind of find that sweet spot between really just getting at an understanding of how close or far were these conceptual models to users' mental models they already had. And then within those, we were able, because we had multiple concepts that we created, and we kept a few things current or stable, I should say, we were able to see if there was any impact from some of those other variables. But it was super important that we kept challenging ourselves, I think, several times. We did spend a bit of time there making sure we were giving people enough detail, but not too much that they were going to get caught up in all these product attributes and details, so that we would never discover, where we were in terms of user experience and how far apart these concepts, the conceptual model and the mental models were. So, I think it's, at the end of the day, it's a little bit of a art, not a science, but I think those are things that you need to realize, that what you put in front of the consumer is everything. It's going to totally dictate what you get back in your learning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think to add to that too, I mean, you're talking about don't be afraid to make some things up, and you have things that don't be afraid to keep things as a control across all concepts, right? These elements, we're going to make sure they're the same so that people don't get hung up on this one has that and that one does not. Keep these all the same so that you can really understand some of the insights on the bigger ideas. The other thing I would add to that is, in this idea of casting the net broad of who you're talking to, make sure the ideas are disparate enough where where you're getting an idea of how they feel about going down different paths. It's not that they're so close together. We're not trying to tease out whether or not you want a button here or a sound there or whatever. We're trying to tease out bigger ideas and how you might conceptually use these things in your life. So.
And Cheryl, your mention of ideas in that last bit, I know you did this organically and not on purpose, legitimately, because this was a new conversation for us in the guide. Is this next topic that we talked about, is when it comes to new product development and innovation, I mean, just being transparent again, like some people are chasing ideas. Some people are actually leveraging insight. And that starting point is fundamentally a change agent for what ultimately comes to life, right? Like you might have a brilliant idea, but what problem is it solving? Is it actually an unmet need in the industry? Like, is there an actual target audience for it? Or like what type of like pre-research or like uncovering do you need to do to like validate that idea? So Mimi, I would love to hear from you to start with on this one. Is that balancing of idea or insight, and even how they work together?
Yeah, I never like to squash ideas that people have, but ideas can come from, and new concept ideas can come from so many different places. New technologies, or just someone on the team had this very specific experience and it sparked a new idea. And I think that that's okay, but it is important, I think, for us as insights people to realize that we know how important it is to be more insight led, to not waste our time just going after something shiny when there's no real fact base or evidence or compelling insight to kind of move us in that direction. But I think it's up to us as the insights professionals to keep insights in front of people, because if they don't have insights, they're just going to start coming up with their own ideas, right? And there is a mix of that. But if we want to be more insight led, we have to do a really good job at keeping insights in front of people, helping people and teams understand how to take insights and action those. I think we need to model that for people and help them a lot. And I think we need to just really tap into the power of how inspiring insights are, because for innovation, I think people they really want to be inspired, and that's on us to do that and to tell the story of the insights and to relay insights in a really inspiring way. And I think that helps us to innovate more and more with insights and not just ideas. Sometimes, someone has an idea and that's legitimate. It doesn't mean that ideas that come from people without necessarily a big insight project aren't legitimate. They can be, right? But we're trying to get people to be inspired by insights, to use them to develop products that people actually want and need. And we can do that more by using insights.
Yeah, and using that word insight for a moment. So something that we talk about a lot at Insights Now is how an insight really is not just a data point. There's some learning or consumer behavior or some driven component. It might be supported by data points, and hopefully it can be validated through actual research. So Cheryl, can you talk a little bit about the difference between like a data point versus an insight in this space?
Yeah. Oh, you give me a tricky one. So it could be tricky for how you're looking at it, right? Because a data point people could think of, oh, it's a quant piece, right? I got 30% of the people who feel this, and that gives you just a flat out number and generalizability to the population, etc. But the insight comes in, how are people interpreting things, and how are the consumers bringing things into their lives and connecting. I think it's connecting those dots, right? It's not a single data point, it's connecting the dots between the data points, reading between the lines, understanding the human behavior behind it, which Insights Now does super well, right? And I think that's a huge part of where the insights come. Anybody can look at a percentage. The insights come from connecting it, analyzing it, interpreting it, understanding how people are behaving, why people are behaving the way they do, based on who those people are, and understanding the person and the consumer.
So we've got one more question as part of our coordinated guide for today before we turn over to some of the other comments that have come in during the session. And this is really, it kind of sparks back to defining failure a little bit. And it's knowing when to quit, right? So we talked about within the failure and fast failure, there could be pivots that are part of that. There's a lot of agility modeling when it comes to innovation and having iterations and being flexible throughout the life cycle and the process itself. But sometimes that failure is just going to reach the bottom. There's only but so many things that you can break and fix before you just gotta leave it alone and either start from scratch or pivot to something completely different. And we realize that's hard for a lot of people, right? We talked about passion that some teammates are going to have and passion behind somebody's idea who's really committed to bringing this to life. So either one of you can start off this one, but it's just like, what advice do you have for somebody if they're thinking that, with this failure, no matter how quickly and fast we got there, just got to hang your hat and it's something to move on from?
Yeah, it's always hard to know when to quit in the innovation space, but I think a lot of things that we talked about are relevant here, right? I think if you have had a good conversation and been very deliberate about knowing what success looks like at the beginning and having some sort of a KPI, then when you have insights to show a failure that's kind of pointing towards, wow, I don't think this is really worth pursuing, now you can have a conversation about that, and you've got these insights to kind of guide that conversation. But I think that doesn't always happen, and a lot of times it's really just a matter of communication, and sometimes I think it's more about managing agreement, right? So everyone, this idea was thrown out there. We did some testing. The data doesn't look that promising. It looks like there's some pretty major obstacles. But everyone says, oh yeah, but we want to, let's still do this. Let's take it to the next step. Let's go here, let's go there. When actually everyone in their own head is really thinking, oh yeah, we should kill this, right? And there's a phenomena that is labeled the going to Abilene, or the Abilene paradox. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that. It's more of a psychology. When people end up, which happens quite a bit, people in groups end up supporting an idea and agreeing to move something forward when they each individually don't think you should do that. And I think we don't realize that happens probably a lot more in groups for a lot of reasons. And so I think as insights leaders, we have to be aware of these kind of team dynamics and human dynamics and provide permission for people to talk about why they agree that maybe we should quit something. Because again, it's hard to do, and pay attention to when maybe people are agreeing, in the outward conversational vote, but in their heads saying, oh yeah, we should definitely kill this, right? So it's tough to facilitate that, but I think it's important, and the insights that you provide during the research help you have that conversation.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that, it comes back to this paradigm shift and this mindset of failing fast. And having an expectation that failure is part of what you're doing. And what is failure and how is that defined with your KPIs, and making sure the entire team, even the idea generators, are all on board with what that looks like. But I maybe, since innovation is one of my just true passions, I may be a little idealistic in this thought, but I don't think you ever really quit entirely, because there's something in there. You might quit on a specific idea, but if you're truly insights led, you are using the information and the insights that you learned in one attempt to carry you into another initiative, another idea, another direction. And it's never lost information. It's never lost learning, right? Or insights. And I just think that it applies to the next steps, no matter what you do, even if you quit on or fail on a very specific idea. If you're doing it right and you're innovating right, you have insights that's going to take you to the next level.
So Cheryl, I think you really started off a great conversation point for a question that came in. So earlier in our conversation, we talked about failure, failing fast, failing big. In the innovation process is a mental construct. And so, Cheryl, you mentioned the idea of setting expectations or having an expectation on the table, coordinated with the group, that just because we're going to field work doesn't mean all outcomes are going to be positive. It doesn't mean everybody's going to love this. So setting that expectation early is a little bit of a mental game, right? You know, accepting that the results might not be rosy, and how do you accept that from a mental perspective without getting too hung up on it? So the question that came in was if we could provide more clarity or more definition on the mental modeling of failure for innovation.
And I think maybe you were talking about the mental modeling in specific, so I'm going to let that part go to you. But I think in certain ways, the mental modeling is the understanding the consumer's mental model for whatever the innovation segment is, right? But it's also about, and going back to your question, is the team's mental model for what failing fast is, and helping them understand that, you know, bringing ideas, like you said, to the table, and what does it look like when something doesn't perform as well as you expect it to? Is it failure or is it not failure? And again, it goes back to defining that up front. I think that you need to set the team's model for failure and success in the beginning, and be ready to adapt that as you go. I mean, you may find everything falls below a certain threshold bar that you set as a KPI. Does that mean everything failed? Not necessarily, because you might have learned something else that's going to take you in a different direction, and might be an idea that you never even got in the first place. So I think it goes back to KPIs, it goes back to team understanding, it goes back to collaboration, and just making sure everybody's on the same page.
Another question that came in was, earlier I asked a question that was about examples of failing fast that help keep a product on track. So similar to that, have either one of you been a part of a project or been a part of a development where failing fast actually expanded the idea to being able to hold that much more value, or being able to take up more like product real estate from what the initial idea was? Like idea A didn't work out well, but it opened up the door to idea B, which was even bigger and better.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't give a specific case study there, but for sure, I think that does happen all the time. I think it's common, and I think if you're open to it and you're looking for that, you're going to find it quite often in the process. And again, I think as insights professionals, that's part of our job to say, pick up on some of these learnings and model what it's like to say, oh, but you know, this maybe, you know, this concept didn't work, and the great thing is here's what we learned, and you know what, this takes me here, and this means we could maybe do this over there. And I think the way we model that, and the way we treat the insights and the failure and the positive spin on the learning that we got from it, and how that can take us from one thing to the next, is part of our job, for sure.
Well, you two women have been amazing panelists today, and we have just a few minutes left with each other. So I can't let the audience go really quick without doing my own little shameless plug of Insights Now's Innovation Center. We didn't dive into this platform specifically for this conversation, but it is something that we used as part of our project that we did a couple of months ago. So the Learning Center is a collaborative online platform. There's 3 different main sections to it. You've got the Learning Center, which is our behavioral library. It's where we publish a lot of consumer insights information around the innovation and new product development space. The Scoring Center is a great resource for ingredient-led companies, specifically in food and beverage. We do have expansions for ingredients and other categories as well, from baby products to personal care and pet, that are on the horizon. And then the Testing Center is what the three of us use. We have a solution called the Concept Scoring Test. And we use that to pressure test those 2D concepts as part of like the larger ecosystem of a project that we had put together for our particular initiative. So if you would like to learn more about failing fast, about agility, and about innovation, feel free to reach out to myself here at Insights Now. I'm also happy to get you in contact specifically with Mimi or Cheryl if you wanted to connect with them. We're all available on LinkedIn. I think we covered most of the questions, but if anything else comes through, we'll for sure follow up with you. We hope you have a great rest of your year. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you learned something new and have some more positive connections with failure going into the new year. So thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.